Dogfight is a 2012 musical by Pasek and Paul based on a film of the same name. It centers around a group of Marines who, before going off to fight in the Vietnam War, decide to hold a contest to see who can bring the ugliest girl to a party called the Dogfight.
The main soldier, Eddie, picks up Rose, our female protagonist. Hijinks ensue, insert romantic subplot, yada yada yada, we don't really care until here. The penultimate scene. We watch an uncharacteristically dark stage as we see all the soldiers except Eddie die, fairly quickly and without breaks in between. Eddie returns home. He's sad for a while. He meets back up with Rose. She's sad. He's sad. And we're supposed to feel sad.
But I didn't. And I want to explain why. Well, mostly because I'm a sociopath, but narratively why.
Part 1. The Boys.
If you've ever seen or listened to the musical, you'll understand me saying that the band of soldiers in the musical are kind of garbage people.
In narrative, they're portrayed as racist, xenophobic, homophobic, transphobic, fatphobic, ableist, jingoistic, and most importantly, dangerously sexist. In most productions of Dogfight, most notably the off-Broadway production, all the boys are portrayed as white, cis, and straight.
They occupy both a narrative and sociological privilege, which is understandable because this play is set in 1967 America, but it's also not questioned by the characters that they come in contact with. And it's also not stated that they're harmful people outright.
We witness the harm they do to local women, local businesses, and most especially Rose. The scene where Rose discovers she's part of a game and is understandably angry takes place between her and another woman in a restroom. The song they sing, Dogfight, focuses on this a little, but you're being told something narratively about Rose, the woman, and by extension, the band of boys. Rose is only in the narrative because those who are narratively and sociologically more privileged than her want her there.
Because she occupies a lower level of the sociological ladder, and because of her gender, and because of Marcy's status as a sex worker, they're subject to the abuse of the boys, and both narratively and metatextually, the boys aren't punished for it. Rose has no way of punishing them, and neither do Pasek and Paul.
Part 2. Narrative Agency.
In any story, there are two types of characters.
There are those who have power and sway in the narrative, characters who are responsible for the outcomes of the story, and we call those characters subjects. On the other hand are any character with no power, the character who the story happens to. We call those characters objects.
And importantly, characters can switch which ones they occupy during the story. A character that starts with no narrative agency can gain narrative agency and vice versa, and a character can also switch between the two rapidly over the course of the story. You can always tell the underlying messages of a story by who the author chooses to give subjective status to and who they objectify. Rose is in every way an object in the story. Her decisions aren't made for her. She's tricked to going to the party with Eddie, and then she's tricked into taking him back after he feels bad. She's in every way an unwilling participant. She's a good person who's just used by terrible people throughout the show. And that's why when she's sad, we feel bad for her. She's framed sympathetically and also powerlessly. In the same way, Eddie and his friends are, at almost every point in the story, subjects. They're responsible for enlisting in the war and tricking Rose and getting Rose back afterwards and all of the other parts of the story. And in that way, they are the willing bullies to Rose's unwilling objectification. And the story knows this. The scene where Rose finds out about the game is framed so that it only works if you're mad at the boys. And you can only be mad at the boys if you recognize their narrative agency. But then we get
here. The narrative tries to do something that I find both horrible and truly important to recognize. The boys in the scene become objects. They're thrust into a dark stage by their own enlistment, but their deaths aren't their own fault. The narrative tries to frame the objectification of Rose and the new objectification of the boys as the same, but I don't think they are.
In every way, these two groups just aren't the same.
For Rose, the audience understands that her pain comes, at least in part, from the patriarchal power structure she's subject to. The boys can harm her without consequence because they're privileged and she's not. Same with Marcy. Same with the unnamed trans woman the boys harass in the beginning.
In almost every way, the same can't be said for the boys.
Even in the case of the Vietnam War, the boys are on the side of the United States, who worked to secure imperial power and suppress regional democracy in the area.
In no way are the boys framed as objects because of oppression. So when the boys become objects right before they die, the narrative is inadvertently pulling a comparison between the harm that they did to Rose during the game and the harm that they're experiencing now due to the Vietnam War. And I don't think that that's an apt comparison.
Part 3. Narrative Framing.
At every point in the narrative, it's framed at the expense of someone else other than the boys. And usually in stories like this, with such clear-cut villains, you get what I like to call the cliff hug moment.
The villain usually starts the narrative being horrible. They'll either continue being horrible and subsequently be cliffed for it, or they'll turn around and be nice and subsequently be hugged for it. The boys are shown to be horrible at first, continue to be horrible, and then get cliffed. This isn't sad for me or the audience because that's what villains do. They get cliffed if they don't get their shit together. It's supposed to be cathartic, the that's what you get type of feeling. But the fact that at the time of death they're objects leaves the death feeling far less cathartic than if they were personally responsible. The evil deeds they did were not shown to be responsible for their deaths.
Eddie, though, is different. In the adaptation, Pasek and Paul seemingly want two different things. In the beginning, Eddie does clear harm to Rose and is framed as horrible. But then, when Rose takes him back afterwards, the audience is somehow supposed to forgive what he did somewhat.
He starts to reform and to get better, but when he leaves, he chooses not to contact Rose. He chooses to hurt her again. So he solidifies his fate. He was bad in the beginning and continues to be bad. He should be cliffed in the eyes of the audience.
But he's not. He survives, unlike the other soldiers, and he returns.
And when this happens, when we get the hug, we don't feel sad because he didn't earn the hug.
The show is, at all times, framed in terms of Eddie and his friends. The other characters are, either literally or figuratively, shadows for the white, cis male characters to play around with and use as motivations.
The Vietnam fighters, who the boys are intending to kill and usurp the regional power of, aren't even portrayed on stage.
So when the characters die, and when we get this moment, I don't feel sad. Because they didn't earn it.